What's up, everyone, and welcome to ClearTalk. So in this video, we're going to have us a little history lesson, okay? We're going to be talking about the U.S.-Iran relations, all right? We're going to talk about the timeline, and this is going all the way back into the 1800s, all right? Is where I'm going to start, preferably around 1850, and coming forward to the present. And while there's been some channels and stuff that have done these videos, and they've 10 minutes or less just spit firing a couple of things at you, um, and while that is informative to some degree, I feel like it needs a little bit more nuance. So I'm going to try to be as quick as I can, but this could wind up being a fairly decently long 30 minutes to an hour video. Again, I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can, those, and try not to be boring. But also, I want to be informative and make sure that I'm giving enough detail to make it help you understand the history here, because this didn't start with this war, especially with going on right now with US, Israel, Iran, and the strikes have been going on. This didn't start with this. It just didn't start last year with us bombing the nuclear plant. It didn't start with October 7th. It didn't start with the Iraq War or 9/11 or any, like, it didn't start with even with the Islamic Revolution. This is something that connections and relations between the U.S. and Iran have been up and down at times for over 100 years, and so I wanted to kind of go over that and give an overall look at why we are where we are at this point. So thank you very much for joining me here. If you are new to the channel, welcome. If you'd like to check out more videos from the channel, please do so. Consider subscribing, like, share, comment, all the good stuff to get more videos in front of more people. If you'd like to check out videos from my other channels, JMDPLAY, play puzzling there. This is my drum channel, video game channel, kind of a hobby jigsaw puzzle channel there. If you're interested in any of that and like what you see, please consider subscribing to those as well. That would be amazing. Help out those channels as well. Patreon there, $3. $3 if you can support $3. You can support any of the channels that you would like. To help grow those channels, help grow Patreon, help grow JMD Nation, and contribute however you like. In helping JMD Nation grow and helping this channel grow and helping keep me doing these channels, all these channels, to entertain you, and to bring information to you also. So thank you very much for joining me here. If you are, and any contribution or support you give is very much appreciated, and I thank you very much. And if you're returning, you're freaking amazing. You are amazing. Thank you very much. Keep coming back over and over, because you're what makes JMD Nation. Okay, so when we're talking about the U.S. again, like I said, this goes back all the way back into the around 1850, when we start to make attempts. Both the UK, British, and in the US were both at that time, even as well as Russia. All your big dogs were trying to increase trade. We're trying to increase relations, and kind of do endeavors in their imperial tendencies, to try to control, gain power, gain strength, gain influence, gain resources, all this to make them greater, richer, all this stuff, right? So you had lots of treaties and stuff going around. With like I said, UK was doing treaties. We were trying to do treaties. Everybody was trying to do these different things. When it come to Iran, we first initiated our development in trying to have U.S.-Iranian relations back in 1850. Okay, this was during the Qajar or Kahar. I don't know exactly how it's said, but their dynasty. Okay, which started all the way back in 1789. And went all the way from 1789 to 1925 as a long monarchy dynasty. And Let's see here. I've got kind of a layout here to give you kind of help you follow along a little bit. You had the high of the dynasty, which was the Shah. Okay, and there's multiple Shahs all throughout these years. And Shah it just means king, basically. Um, and during this time, of course, in the 19th century, you had what was called the Great Game, which was basically where Britain and Russia were um, trying to game out, basically, their imperial, like I said, imperial tendencies, trying to gain power, resources, and whatnot. And Iran was, of course, one of their targeted countries. And they had tried to influence and gain influence. But ultimately, the dynasty kept pushing back, kept kind of resisting to some degree, didn't really want either to, whether it was Western power or influence, culture, to uh, take over, the country and its culture, the Persian Empire, the Persian history and in traditions and all that stuff. And then also, of course, even from Russia, and their influences and culture around uh, uh, the potential for communism and stuff like that, which would later come. Um, this was uh, again, the dynasty kept pushing back and pushing back and pushing back, and for the most part, held off up until toward the end days there. But in 1850 through 1851, the U.S. made attempts to start a treaty relationship with Iran in kind of a trade, friendship, commerce, working together kind of treaty. It's called the Treaty of Friendship and Commerce. UK had similar treaty named like this as well with a couple of countries, but ultimately it fell through with Iran because up until 1851 they were right on the final of trying of signing onto it, but the U.S. Senate had added in this clause, this most favored nation clause. You heard that recently from somebody, most favored nation commercial clause that ultimately that was thrown in kind of like the last minute, I think. And Iran, the dynasty, the Shah did not exactly um, like the way this was stated. They didn't agree with. It felt too. I guess it felt probably too open and too favored to that influence or profiteering, profit shares would go more to the favored nation, which would ultimately probably not be them. So they really didn't agree with this and sort of shut down those talks. There was a kind of an agreement. I didn't put it down here, but in 1988, there was kind of an agreement, sort of, that was a little bit more laxed in just sort of a basic trade kind of thing, I think, or dealings, understanding, like, but it it what didn't have a huge influence on their connection. But that's where this all kind of started. Um, then you had as the monarch. At this point, it was just simply just that a monarch that controlled all of government, controlled all of the lifestyle and the laws and everything of the country. But you were having more and more of a concern and uprising, upset amongst the population that they wanted, seeing these democratic countries, the Western lifestyle, the other, thing, democracy is becoming more of a thing. People having more ability uh, to have a say in what their daily lives and the government and how they, connected with people and how they based policies and all this stuff. There's this sentiment was growing within the nation, and the dynasty noticed that, and so they decided to actually develop a parliamentary system that would help to kind of alleviate those concerns and those issues to try, to keep the people, basically, from what I could tell, keep the people um, from calm and happy to some degree. So to 1905 to 1911, you had the Persian Constitutional Revolution. In the 1906 is when the Shah at that time, which was Muzaffar al-Din Shah, established this parliament, which was I don't know if it's Majlay or Malays or whatever. I don't know exactly how to say it, but established this parliament, and it was established to curtail the authority of the Shah and to introduce a system of checks and balances. Okay, so just try to implement some reforms around how laws were implemented, how things were done, some policies and stuff like that, lifestyle curtailing or whatever. And but even in implementing this in the parliament, they were having troubles with actually creating these reforms. I guess probably agreeances. This is an early system. People don't completely agree on things. That's what I took from it. And it ultimately, when the new Shah that came into power, Muhammad Ali Shah, he wanted to take back more power. He wasn't could see that there was an issue with Parliament and being able to do these reforms, and so he wanted to curtail and bring back power back to the all supreme, or the dynasty. So he attempted to actually dissolve this Parliament. Ultimately, though, it was not successful. Completely dissolving it. But this whole act, this whole battle within, this internal battle that was going on, and trying to develop and basically modernize the system into and having to deal with bringing in all these different ideas and opinions and feelings, belief systems, ideologies, all this different stuff to try to come to a cohesive governing style was causing problems. It was clearly harder to establish than what I guess they initially thought. All right, and in this created internal conflicts and stuff, which, because remember, Britain and Russia were both, constantly throughout the 19th century trying to weave their way into Iran in control and influence and into their resources and stuff like that. That this is when you had an invasion, actually, and this was during World War II, from my understanding, in that kind of era where Russia and Britain both invaded into Iran. Russia taking up parts of the north, and Britain taking parts of the south. And this ultimately caused even more uproar in the country, and created a issue where the Shah and the dynasty was having more and more of a struggle to be able to contain the concerns and uproar from the population. And so you wind up having this military leader, Reza Khan. All right. In 1921, he was coming of influence within the military, coming of influence even with the people, and with the assistance of Britain in 1921, they basically did a coup of the then Qajar dynasty of the Shah leadership, and overthrew him. So that wound up becoming the end of that dynasty, and introduced the next dynasty, which was headed up by Reza himself. In 1925, he became the new Shah, Raza Shah Pahlavi dynasty, and this started the Pahlavi dynasty. Okay, and in this, because he had the backings of Britain. He was a more Western, uh, uh, pro-Western culture kind of person. He started modernizing with more Western influence, started replacing Islamic law with more Western laws. And in this, he was even getting very forceful. Okay. It wound up becoming as authoritarian as some would have considered the other dynasty. He was even more authoritarian, and ultimately was continue trying, but in a way of trying to pressure and force Western culture onto a society that was not used to Western culture, and in a way where he was even forcing it and banning um, traditional Islamic laws, traditional Islamic cultural stuff of clothing, um, and religious practices, the use of the hijab, or it's called something else to some degree of, I guess there, um, uh, literally banning those things, and even sometimes uh, with the military force or security force that would implement it in a way that they would force women to remove them, again, just trying to force a Western culture on the people, which to some degree, some probably was acceptable of it, but those that were more traditional religion, Islam religion, in practice, in life, um, didn't wasn't very accepting of this, and did not like this forcefulness of Western culture on them. Um, and so that created a lot of issue within the country. You had then, okay, this was in 1925. So then you have, by 1941, you have British and Soviet invasion yet again. All right, this is around the World War II. All right, because the Shah that they first implemented, Raza Shah Pahlavi, he actually was a little friendly with Nazi Germany. And so that didn't work in the favor of British or Russian um, influence, because because both British and Soviet, along with U.S., were all fighting Nazi, trying to push back the Nazi Germany, and didn't like the fact that this Shah that was in place was Nazi friendly, and so they invaded again and removed him from power, and then installed his son, who was more sympathetic to the was less sympathetic to the Nazi Germany and more sympathetic towards British or Soviet influence. Um, so that was Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, which was the son of Reza Shah. You had a Soviet occupation after that until 1946, until Muhammad Raza decided that it was he wasn't liking, because at this point there was a party, the Tudor party, that was gaining influence and power, and mostly I think it was more northern Iran. Because of the Soviet occupation, they were sympathetic to Russia and communist um, influence. And in order to kind of thwart that from them gaining popularity or gaining influence, they basically was like, look, we need to. He wanted to take back his country, and sort of basically, to some degree, expelled Soviet occupation, to ask them to leave. Basically get out. And that's what happened there. All right, to try to again calm down and prevent, to some degree, more and more influence by the Soviet or even the British to some degree, although he was a little bit more favored to the British, from my understanding. Throughout these years, all right, Britain was able to gain a lot of influence and power in the oil industry of Iran because they had increased in oil productivity. There were that's the big thing for Iran at that time. Um, and you had the development in those in these years of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Right, this was a British, a joint British-Iranian oil company, uh, where and Britain was basically getting a lot of the benefits of it. The idea was a shared profiting of the oil from Iran, but ultimately the Britain was taking more of it, was getting the better of this. Okay. Um, and in 1951, you wind up having the very first democratically elected prime minister that was put into place. That's the one thing that continued from the rise up here with the modernization and Western influence, with the creation of the parliament. They had started putting in prime ministers through all this time as well. And this point in 1951, Mossadegh was the first democratically elected prime minister. Okay. Before that, it was just people appointed. This was the first democratically elected, where the people of Iran actually elected him. And he would become the only democratically elected prime minister ever in Iran. At first, he basically wanted to audit. He wanted to gain paperwork and information from Britain on the oil company to audit and make sure that Iran was receiving the proper royalties from the oil that was being, extracted and traded and everything amongst the two countries. Because it was basically suspicious that Britain, and I think it had been suspicious that Britain was taking advantage and that Iran was not getting the royalties that they were supposed to be getting, because you basically had Britain just becoming more richer off of it, while the Iranian people were still poor, and and the government didn't feel like they were getting enough to from this venture with Britain to help take care of their people, and provide for their people. And Britain basically disagreed and rejected giving them this information. So, in retaliation of that, Mossadegh decides to nationalize the oil industry and take back the oil company, take full possession of the oil company, so that Iran would trade its oil and get 100% basically of the profits, which this very much angered Britain, clearly, because whenever any country decides that they want to take a little bit more of their stake in their own natural resources, to Western civilization, to Western governments, that's like a kick in the face. Oh, how dare you? How dare you try to prevent us from taking your resources? We've seen that recently, right? We've seen that recently with Venezuela and the U.S. And during all these times, the U.S. was pretty much just trying to play pretty and trying to play kind and nice. Really wasn't getting too hard into the geopolitical issues between Britain and Iran, or even with Russia. It's pretty much just kind of offset from it during this entire time. But with this happening here, the UK branched out to the US and was for support, because look, like, hey, Don't you agree? They shouldn't be trying to cut us out of this oil deal. Um, and so we need your support. Which at that time, the PM for Britain was Winston Churchill, and he planned to overthrow the PM. All right, but Truman at this time was president, and Truman did not support this. He did not support. He did not see a problem, basically, with Mossadegh nationalizing. He didn't. He wasn't in agreement with the imperialist like nature of Britain and trying to take and control the oil industry. And he kind of low key supported Mossadegh in this in his nationalization of oil industry. He just didn't have any interest in it. Didn't really like imperialistic ventures whatsoever. Honestly, from what I could tell. So he wasn't on board, and this kind of put a bit of a pause on Britain doing anything, especially without the support of the U.S. At the same time, also, you had the Tudeh Party, remember, the Russian-influenced Communist Party, which at first did not actually support Mossadegh at all. But then when he started seeing this pushback against Britain, they started seeing this pushback from Mossadegh on Britain, they go, maybe we could work with this guy. And so they kind of reversed their support and started actually supporting him, hoping that they could influence him to allow more interest and influence in connection with Russia. So this just added to the concern and upset of Britain that Iran could be susceptible to Russian influence, communist influence, which ultimately also within short time would cause the U.S. to actually get involved. But that wasn't until Eisenhower took the presidency. All right. So in 1953, we had finally UK was able to actually get the U.S. to get involved through Eisenhower in supporting them with Operation Ajax in a coup d'etat. This was a CIA operation where they basically paid and bust in agitators and helped to fund and pay for state rebels in the time. They were like busting in 200-300 people to be agitators in the streets and whatever, and to cause uproar and conflict against the government, to cause protests, cause a dissenting operation within the state to try to overthrow Mossadegh. The first attempt failed. There was 2 attempts. The first attempt failed, and because the Shah was actually supporting this coup d'etat, after this first attempt failed, they had to flee to Iraq and then ultimately go to Italy to get more protection. Then there was a second attempt by which Churchill and Eisenhower and operations of the CIA that was a little bit stronger and wound up being ultimately successful in getting Mossadegh to step down and leave the country. And with this happening, they were able to reinstall Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as the Shah. He returned and would then continue to rule and reign, a continuation of that dynasty for 26 years. At that time, Pahlavi appointed a new prime minister, which was Fazlala Zahidi. I think that's how you say that. As the new PM, which was much more favorable to doing business, basically, to getting into the oil, which ultimately got Iran into OPEC at first, got them into OPEC, into a deal that was an oil deal with all the neighboring countries, including, and then of course the extra was Venezuela. Um, and at this point also is when, interestingly enough, Eisenhower helped to launch Iran's nuclear program through what was called the Atoms of Peace. And this is where Iran started. They got their first nuclear reactor. The program, was increasing with the help and assistance of the U.S. to help with energy and stuff, and to help the society, at large. And so it's interesting. It's interesting that we have a problem. We overthrow a democratically elected government, prime minister, because he wants to nationalize and not be taken advantage of by Britain. We assist in overthrowing him to re-implement an authoritarian dynasty government, the Shah. Then turn around and give that authoritarian government a nuclear program. It's interesting, huh? It's interesting. It's very interesting. All right. From 1953, when the Shah was able to take back over, 1953 to 1979, the Shah became more authoritarian in Western development. All right. You had the 1963 White Revolution, which was basically a continuation of modern Westernization, land reformation, and different stuff. The idea of it was to try. The Shah was trying to attempt to do reforms and change policies in order to gain favor, ultimately to gain favor of your more peasantry, poor people outside of outside of the cities, in your more rural areas, to try to gain their influence, because a lot of those groups have different ideology or culture, like they have different connections, some of which were more favored to different areas outside of Iran, and they wanted to more coalesce those people, from my understanding, around a westernization, and show that a more westernization style would benefit them in making them more prosperous or whatever. But it ultimately wind up backfiring, and these groups actually, instead of becoming more favorable to the Shah, wind up actually just being more resentful and more opposed to them. And it was at this time that you had a guy by the name of Khomeini, who was starting to rise up as an opposition to the Shah and bringing back a more Islamic law, an Islamic lifestyle, in an anti-Westernized sentiment. All right, for those around in the country that was not exactly approving or liking of the Shah's authoritarian Western law like implementations that they had been doing and had been living under for now, what was it, the 40 some odd years or so. Well, at this point, yeah, around 35, 40 years, whatever. And so he was starting to come up, gaining popularity. He was kind of the guy on the front lines, showing opposition, telling the people to rise up, telling the people, to push back against Westernization, and Ultimately, this wound up with him being arrested. He was in jail for like 8 months, and then exiled in 1964, and he was exiled from Iran until 1979, when he wound up eventually being brought back. In 1976, one key thing that started causing even more uproar is the Shah decided to change the Iranian solar calendar. And this was changed around more of like I'm thinking Greek, but I'm probably wrong. It's a different kind of calendar, solar calendar, that changed the like overall state year for the country, and this upset a lot of your traditional fundamentalist Islamic, citizenry of the country. Angered people very much so. And then, of course, through the 1970s, there was an oil boom because of the oil deals with the Britain and the U.S., and this caused increased inflation and wind up ultimately separating the rich and poor through, the more capitalist-like nature of the oil system and for the country. So you just had a separation of wealth that continued to go. It was like looked upon that the Shah was taking all of the benefits of this industry. They were enriching themselves by billions and billions of dollars. The Shah family was taking in this, and so there was this overall tension growing within the country that the Shah was enriching themselves with these oil deals, and they were corrupt. And were corrupt by westernization, were corrupt by the Western capitalist, market profiteering system that the U.S. and U.K. and were bringing about in the country, and where the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poor, and not seeing the benefits. And so just as we've seen here in the U.S., this same as now. It's a continued growth, but this was like accelerated in Iran around because Iran not having the ability to actually fully control their industry, more unlike what we can do. So it was just an acceleration of this very quickly, which ultimately began in 1978 with protests. All right. The protests grew and grew over the summer, and there were moments where the Shah would try their best to appease and pull back on laws and policies that they had put in place, pulling back on their authoritarian-like stuff, trying their best to appease the population. I mean, they went to extremes, almost cutting back everything that they had put in place just to try to make the people happy. But during this entire time also, Khomeini was continuing to have influence. When he was exiled, he first was exiled to Iraq, and he was still had a channel of influence that he could communicate with people that shared his sentiment around removal or decreasing the Western influence. And he was continuing to gain influence and gain popularity within the country, especially around people that would rather bring more traditional things back into the forefront, and expel Westernization. When the Shah started to see this rise and started to see his influence continue to push back and cause more protests, because they would pull back stuff, and it would kind of calm the protests to some degree a little bit, but then Khomeini would start somehow make some kind of communication and get them uproared again, and it would just grow and grow and grow and grow, and it's a back and forth kind of thing. The Shah started to pressure the Iraqi government to get, to have him leave and to expel him from Iraq, which made him then move to France, which actually helped him even more because the media and ability to share information was even more um, uh, the technology and stuff was even more capable in Europe than it was in Iraq at that time. So it actually almost it wind up causing his influence to grow even faster. And you wind up having even media outlets that placed him forefront. I think BBC was named as one of the major ones that wind up putting him on TV, where he was trying to basically say that he was wanting to remove the oppression of the Shah on his people and wanting to bring about at this time he was basically pretending that he wanted to bring about more democratic uh, a more democratic government, more of a government for the people, to allow the people to come from out the oppression of the Shah dynasty, and that's the way he was being platformed. Although unknowing to many, he was actually underneath wanting to implement a theocratic, full-on Islamic law governing from the get-go. And at this time, this started to put a lot of pressure on the Carter was president at this moment, and this started putting a lot of pressure on him to backtrack and end his support for the Shah because of the continued uproar and the continued pushback and the infighting of people against the Shah, and the Shah losing its ability to control and keep control of the country. This ultimately put pressure on the Carter administration to start to end their support for the Shah. And this is when you wind up having people within the administration at that time, and along with many others, admittedly, thinking that, again, Khomeini was going to be someone that they could potentially work with, that just wanted to bring back, kind of be a middle ground of Westernization and Islamic traditions, is what it was. He was trying to sell himself as, and people even within the U.S. intelligence and administration thought that was accurate, thought that was what he wanted to do, thought that would be beneficial, especially since the Shah was losing control. And so they more or less said, okay, fine. Maybe allowing him to become into power is going to be the best thing. Maybe we can work with this, because clearly the Shah is losing power and this losing influence, and we can't do anything with him anymore. So that's when you wind up having the Islamic Revolution in 1979, where ultimately the Shah was exiled. And you had a kind of a power struggle kind of come about, where Khomeini was allowed to come back to the country. There was a new prime minister at that time that had sort of temporary control. And he was he brought back Khomeini as a way to try to make a joint government, basically, with Khomeini's things that he wanted to implement, along with what, the prime minister at that time wanted to, again, have a joint, more, again, democratic government and governance. But once Khomeini got back, using his influence and popularity within the country, he winds up overthrowing and forcing that prime minister out of position, so that he can ultimately take full control and full power. Okay? Again, he was pretending to be a Democrat, but he established a theocracy. And he wound up taking full control and became the first Islamic republic supreme leader. All right. And this is the start. This is the start where US and Iran really starts to, little by little over the years, have a fracturing. Okay. Where the US would at times use Iran to their advantage when they needed to, but then turn around and almost kind of blackmail or throw them under the bus. In 1979, the first major conflict between the new Islamic Republic and the U.S. was a hostage crisis that was at the U.S. Embassy, where some students attacked the embassy. And this was basically an attack against Western, and against America, the idea of Westernization, where they took 52 Americans. I think it was 66 people overall, but 52 were Americans, diplomats and stuff like that. And they were held for 444 days. All right. This was during the Carter administration. And it ended with the Algiers, I guess that's how you say, Accord, which was in 1981. All right, in January, the very beginning of 1981, and this was immediately within like hours or minutes after Reagan took office. All right, and what's interesting here is this: Reagan won. A little side note: Reagan won the presidency because of the sentiment that Carter had been unable to negotiate and situate this hostage crisis for over a year. All right. And at that time, it was looking like, hey, he's just incapable. And Reagan was promising his one of his main core things on his in going for the presidency was that he was going to free these hostages, that Carter was incompetent and that he would free them immediately. He would be able to negotiate and free them immediately. So make me president and I will bring back your people. And so, but it has come out since then through some underground stuff, basically. And I've talked about this before, where it looked actually like Reagan was doing some back channel treason. Honestly, this is honestly treason, where he was actually in communications with Iran, with leadership in Iran, and actually persuaded them to hold these hostages against the will of Carter, just so that he could take the presidency, and in favor would like pull back from trying to influence or have any like pressure on Iran. Okay, and Iran endeavors. Basically, he was basically, I'll let you do whatever you want. That was what he told him, anyways. And so to this degree, that he would, in order to try to secure his presidency, because it was looking very scarce that he would not get president, that Carter was going to wind up winning again. all right, that he was able to take his presidency because he negotiated for them to keep the hostages, to keep Americans held hostage, just so he could take presidency, and then they be freed. That is treasonous. That is treasonous. And this is, anyways. Just a little side note, little tangent. So then at the same time during this, we had the start of the Iran-Iraq War. All right, 1980 to 1988, the Iran-Iraq War. And during this war, this is where you had Saddam was basically wanting to thwart the influence and power that Iran was gaining, or whatever. There was, didn't like it. And during the Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. actually supported Iraq. That's who we chose to support. We supported Saddam. Okay, we supported Saddam Hussein in invading Iran. All right. At the same time, during these years, all right, funny enough though, in 1985, the U.S. secretly funnels arms into Iran, all right, so that the officials of Iran could funnel them to rebel groups in Lebanon to fight against Hezbollah. Yeah, that proxy of Iran that was holding American hostages. Hezbollah, being a Shia militia type group, against the actions of the U.S. aiding Iraq, took American hostages. And in a way of gaining access to trying to get those hostages released, the U.S. secretly makes a deal with Iran, with leadership in Iran, to funnel arms through them to a rebel group from Nicaragua, so that they could fight and put pressure on Hezbollah to release hostages. This was all going on during the war. I say, when the U.S. or even someone like UK or whatever, when Western civilization can use somebody to their benefit, they will use them. They will use back channels. They will use underground ways, make deals with quote unquote enemies to make sure that they get their way. In 1991, you had the Persian Gulf War, which is where Saddam invaded Kuwait. All right. So again, and I'm placing this in not as a connection to Iran necessarily, but the fact that we were supporting Iraq, we were supporting Saddam in his invasion of Iran, just to turn around within that decade, at the end of that decade, to then go against him in his invasion of Kuwait. Okay. I threw in here as an extra. At this point in 1989 is when a new supreme leader, all right, Khamenei, took control. Khamenei, or Khamenei, this one, all right. I think he died. I can't remember exactly how. And then Khamenei, or Khamenei, who is the one that recently was assassinated, all right, he took control. He had been prime minister for a little while throughout the 80s, and took supreme leader in 1989. All right. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit. We're going to fast forward to 9/11. All right. We're going to fast forward to 9/11. I told you this might be a long video, but we're trying to go over all this. I'm trying to give you as much information and break it down as the best I can. And yes, please, again, you can go back, you can look it all up, get more details, because there's a lot more nuance, honestly. A lot of things that were happening in and outs. But this is kind of the best summary I could kind of come up with. To give you enough information, but also not make it so short that it's like, that you walk away feeling like, I don't think I was told everything here. All right, fast forward to 9/11. 9/11 happens. All right, this is where the towers were attacked. This was the one and only, or one of the biggest attack on American soil, that had ever happened. Right. And the U.S. basically declares a war on terror. And this was against Iraq and Afghanistan. All right. Going after Saddam, Bush pushed up the weapons of mass destruction. And Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, so we had to take him out. We weren't concerned with Iran at this moment. And ultimately what eventually led to us finding bin Laden too. I threw that in there, although this not necessarily at this point was that in the works. But we invade Afghanistan first, all right, because we know Al-Qaeda was behind the 9/11, but we think it's through Saddam and through the Taliban, who was giving aid to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And so through some back channel works and deals, we actually get Iran to help us hunt down the Taliban that was aiding Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Okay? Iran helps us. Iran assists the U.S. after 9/11. All right? 2001, we invade Afghanistan. We have the U.S.-Iran bond agreement, which was an agreement where with state building and in training practices of Afghans for security and whatnot in Afghanistan. This was the agreement that we went under with Iran. All right. Just to turn around, a year later, Bush labels Iran, along with Iraq and North Korea, accesses of evil. A year later, even though Iran was assisting us in hunting down the Taliban, when Iran was assisting us in state building and assisting us in security training of Afghans, they were assisting, and yet Bush labels them, along with Iraq and North Korea, accesses of evil. When he does this, Iran decides to cut the U.S. off, stop meetings, stop the secret meetings and stuff that we were having with U.S. Intelligence and diplomats, and they themselves just completely focus on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to take them out. All right. And this is where, which you'll see later, and we've talked about also, this is where you come into the Qasem Soleimani, where he was a part of the Iranian IRGC at this point, and a brigade section of the RGC that fought against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. He fought against Al Qaeda and the Taliban to take them out in assistance to the United States. He fought ISIS, which was a section of Al Qaeda. He fought against ISIS, fought against Al Qaeda, just for us to turn around and Trump assassinate him later, and which we'll bring up later. All right. In 2003, Bush invades Iraq because of the weapons of mass destruction. We topple Saddam, who was later executed. All right. And during this time, from 2003 to 2015, we have a continuation through the UN and stuff. We're trying to make these kind of agreements, or getting Iran to agree to not to control their nuclear enrichment, because at this point, there's a continuation of their nuclear enrichment, which we gave them the nuclear program, remember? And there was a concern, particularly Republicans had this concern that Iran, those that were, probably a part of trying to actually put Iran on the axis of evil and call them a terrorist state, wanted to make it to where they reduced their nuclear output so that they were bound and determined again, because they thought they thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and in connection to Iran, they were assumed that they had weapons of mass destruction as well. Even though intelligence had continued to state and show that Iran stopped their nuclear program in 2003. Particularly probably after Bush made this declaration that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And they saw how we went after Saddam, even though he did not have weapons of mass destruction. And they were like, you know what? We don't want this on us. So we're gonna cut it. We're gonna enrich as we normally do for energy and stuff, but let's cut the program. And that's what even up to recent intelligence stated, that they were not trying to create a nuclear weapon. And this has been stated over and over and over and over again by U.S. intelligence. Even though we've had leadership, even though we've had the likes of Netanyahu all the way back to the 2000s trying to declare and trying to pull the U.S. into fighting against Iran, to topple the Islamic Republic, claiming over and over and over and over and over again that they were only months away, days away, years away from having a nuclear weapon that they never had. And we're not trying to have. Leading up to 2015, when Obama tries to, it actually started in 2013. They had early agreements in 2013 with Iran, kind of an early stage deal for releasing sanctions and Iran decreasing their nuclear uranium enrichment. But it came to a full deal in 2015 under the Obama Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, all right, which lifted pretty much all the sanctions that we had on Iran, giving them access to money that was theirs, all right? Let's be clear. This was Iranian funding, Iranian money that we had sanctions on and held up on banks where they could not access it. All right, billions of dollars of their money that they could use to, do, projects, infrastructure, or whatever, they could use in their country to, feed people, whatever, whatever they were going to use it for, whatever they would use it for, to improve their economy and bring it back up. They lifted sanctions. This was their money. And in doing so, Iran agreed to reducing their uranium output production to minimal standards, so that they could at least, have a nuclear program for energy, but also it not be high that people were in fear that they were creating a weapon, even though they weren't. All right. And they also dismantled and redesigned nuclear reactors. And this was limiting their uranium enrichment for at least 15 years. That was the agreement. And this was to ensure for the American people, for the Republicans that always, or whoever was always thinking that Iran was going to have a nuclear weapon at some point, and that they were going to be, danger to the U.S., danger to Israel, all this. This was to ensure that they would not have one. And there were regular audits and stuff that were made, and they were upholding to that. All the audits going in, checking the nuclear program. They were given access to the facilities. They were holding up to the deal. They were not enriching uranium over what was regulated in the deal. They were going and complying by all standards of the deal, all the way through 2018, when Trump took office and ripped up the deal. Trump comes in and says, "This is not a good deal. We're getting out of it. We're withdrawing from the lifting of the sanctions. We're withdrawing from the nuclear program agreement." And they put on massive sanctions on the country, completely throwing their economy right back where it was, even worse than what it was before the nuclear agreement that Obama got into. Devastating their economy, causing, again, an uproar in the population. An anger that I think is somewhat probably for Iranians and has grown to kind of, I think has grown in sentiment even up to now. A distaste and hate for the U.S., but at the same time, a distaste or a insecurity in their own government, and their own government's ability to provide them the life that they would like, or the standards and, economy, existence, or whatever, because of the quote unquote threat that the government has to those that, see them as that way, that there's nothing that this government can do to quell that opinion that they are a threat. When ultimately what it is just what has happened. Because understand, during all of this happening since World War II is when Israel was established, and where the Zionist regime and control of Israel has grew and grew and grew, with this idea of the greater Israel that we've talked about, and their distaste for Arabs really in general, while they claim, that they don't really have a problem, they honestly do have a distaste for Arabs. And specifically a distaste for Iran because of the, Persian biblical aspects of Amalek and everything else. Like there's this in this thousands of year old quote unquote war, hatred for these people in general. I mean, I'm sorry, but it is. So this has continued, and this has become a bigger issue all along. And Israel has been wanting to try to get presidents for decades now to push back, to go harder at Iran, to take, out their Islamic revolutionary republic. And the whole back and forth, we're okay with them, then we're not okay with them. We're okay with them, then we're not okay with them. We'll do deals with them, but then we rip them up and we go back against them, and we help them, and then we punish them, and then we help them, and then we punish them. It's a continuation of, in my opinion, poor foreign policy and diplomacy with Iran, where if we had acted in good faith and worked and not tried to be so imperialistic or so controlling, and not just the U.S., but Britain, the whole idea of Western colonization, imperialism at large. Ironically for the U.S., that we tried to get away from that in our initiation of this country from Europe and the practices that they were doing. We were, the attempt was to get away from that, but we ultimately now 250 years later are just as bad, if not worse. As a matter of fact, I would argue worse. And it's like the UK is to some degree learned from their history. There's still some bad there, but they've learned from their history a little bit and try to be a little bit better at it. And the U.S. was, I think, also here before Trump, before this age of Trumpism. We were trying, I think, to also improve and learn from our past mistakes. And not only our past mistakes, but the mistakes of, like, Britain and tendencies that we had even enacted in cahoots with Britain. But unfortunately, Trumpism and the connections and influence that he has allowed to take over his administrations has just completely ruined that and taken us back decades at this point. So Trump rips up the deal, removes the sanctions, or removes the deal with the sanctions, withdraws from the program, reasserts sanctions, forces Iran, tries to force Iran to zero uranium enrichment, okay? And this is all supported by Republicans, Israel, and funny enough, Saudi Arabia. In 2019, the Trump administration designates the RGC, which is the military wing of Iran, as terrorist group. And this is the first time any military group, government military group, has been designated as a terrorist group. This was the first time, and we did that to Iran. And this came out later, weeks later, actually, that Bibi Netanyahu, was the one that requested that the U.S. do this. And Trump gave him what he requested. This all makes Iran, through all of this, continue the nuclear program and start to enrich even more in fear of what the U.S. And Israel at this point was going to do, and that they would need to potentially have some sort of safeguard, ballistic weapons or whatever, to defend themselves if they were brought under attack. 2019, you have some Saudi oil fields attacked. The Houthis claim, not spelt right, claim responsibility for this attack, which is a quote-unquote proxy extension, according to the U.S., of Iran, although they are their own militia group in Yemen that just support Iran. Iran does aid them in weapons and ammunition, but they are this broader wing of Iran, basically. The Houthis claim responsibility, but the U.S. ultimately blames Iran. Say, yeah, well, you may have done it, but you were told by Iran to do it. Even though there's really never been any evidence that Iran has told any of these quote-unquote proxies to do anything. They are kind of an independent guerrilla warfare armies that basically decide what they want to do. And matter of fact, there's more evidence to show that Iran has told them to resist more than actually potentially told them to actually engage. These are actually more proxy-like extreme hyper groups, Hezbollah, Houthis, even to some degree Hamas, and some of the Shia militias within Iraq and Syria and stuff like that. They're more like irrational groups that can sometimes do things without thinking or do things on their own accord. And then Iran has to be like, look, calm the fuck down. That wasn't necessary. At least if they think so. Now, when there have been times where Iran hasn't said anything to them, I mean, yeah, you could argue that was just because they were okay with it. They didn't tell them to do it, but they were okay with it. But most of these groups just do it on their own. But anyway, nevertheless, the U.S. blames Iran for it. In 2020, this is when Trump kills Qasem Soleimani. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, which was like the second under command, the second in command in Iran under Khamenei, and 7 other Iranian and Iraqi nationals. This is where these guys were supposed to be coming together for a joint a joint meeting to talk about relations and stuff or whatever. I think it was even to some degree some sort of a like trying to come to some sort of agreement between on discussions with either Saudi Arabia or the U.S. or whatever, or whatever. I can't remember exactly, but they were trying to meet for a meeting about relations in the region, and we struck and killed these. Again, Qasem Soleimani, which Trump's regime designated as a terrorist, because he was a part of the IRGC, and they designated the IRGC a terrorist group. And he was one of the top commanders in the IRGC. He was killed, even though this was a guy who aided the U.S. fighting against ISIS and Al Qaeda that attacked us. Okay? Understand this. All right. 2022, Biden attempts to make nuclear agreement talks with Iran, which is something that we wanted. We wanted him to get back into the nuclear deal, even though he was hesitant about getting back into the deal to the degree that Obama did. He wanted a little bit more stricter deal, which I didn't agree to. I thought that we should have just done exactly the same fucking agreement. But in the times that he was trying to get back into the agreement is when Russia invaded Ukraine, which caused us to pause those talks. And by the time we got back to it, there was things going on. And agreements weren't being had. You wind up having a woman-led protest in Iran around like women's freedoms, more Western-like freedoms that they were wanting, women's rights and whatnot. And they were protesting against the supreme leader and asking for the overthrow to some degree of the government for them to step down, denouncing him and ending the republic. Iran, the government decided to get strict on them to try to deter the protests, restricting internet and phone use. They wound up arresting 12,500 people, and through skirmishes and stuff, wound up killing 200 protesters. Horrible, absolutely horrible. Should not have happened. But it was all in a way of trying to stay in power and cut protests down, and horrible. And after this, Biden, of course, added sanctions, and the nuclear talks stalled pretty much completely. At that point, in 2023, though, we wind up doing a prisoner swap deal where we wavered some sanctions, $6 billion in sanctions, for the release of 5 Iranian American dual citizenship citizens that were being detained in Iran. So this was a deal that Biden did. He got a lot of backlash from Republicans on this deal, basically saying that we were giving them ransom for American citizens, and that was bad. I thought, we would do anything for American citizens, but I guess Republicans they want some discretion on that. They want some stuff around that. And I'm skipping here on this because, as of course, at this point we know what's happened here lately. You had the Gaza and Israel war, genocide, that brought a lot of sorry, I've been talking for a while here. Brought a lot of pressure on Iran, because you had Hezbollah get into it. You had the Houthis get into it with Israel, of course. It led to Israel attacking Iran. Iran had to attack back. First time ever Iran did a attack on Israel. But it was, of course, in response, something that Iran has always done. They have never been the offensive attacker. They've always only attacked in defense or in response. The responses were always laid out and given ahead of time so that there was no problem in any type of protection on Israel's part. It's amazing how Iran is such a fucking threat to Israel that they literally give the information of how they're going to retaliate, what they're going to shoot, and how they're going to shoot it to the U.S. so that the U.S. can tell Israel what's going to happen so that they can protect themselves. It's amazing. There's such a threat. There's such a threat to Israel that all of that is done. And then, of course, again, Trump gets into office, pushing back again on the fact of zero uranium enrichment. And whatsoever, even for energy, absolutely zero, no nuclear program whatsoever, which goes against international law, international privilege, basically, right of any sovereign country to do so. Every sovereign country has the right to enrich uranium to a certain percentage degree in order to supply themselves with energy and whatnot. And yet we are asking them yet again, after our original ripping up of the deal, for zero enrichment. Something that no country should agree to, would agree to. And yet, before we attacked this latest time, starting this war, Iran basically had given up all their rights. They had given in and was forfeiting enrichment just to make a deal. But unfortunately, once again, the U.S. under this administration and their foreign policy that revolves wholly around Israel never intended on making a deal. And as it's been stated, Israel was going to attack no matter what. No matter how much officials are trying to, and people in the administration are trying to backtrack, it was stated Israel was going to attack. They were going to do it anyways. They were not willing to make a deal. Netanyahu has never wanted to make a deal. He has been wanting for decades to topple the Islamic Republic. This is a holy war. This is a war for him that goes back thousands of years. A war of aggression, a war of retaliation on people that have, at this point, literally no connection to the events thousands of years ago. But nevertheless, this is a biblical holy war for people like Netanyahu, or at least that's what he claims it to be for. When we really know he just wants imperial power and the idea of the greater Israel and wanting to take as much land as possible. And is using a war against his so quote unquote biblical enemies in order to do so. Because while all this is going on, Israel has cut off aid to Gaza 100% once again. We have illegal settlers going rampant in the West Bank. We have Israel doing evacuation notices on southern Lebanon, forcing people out, and a potential on-the-ground incursion in the works to take southern Lebanon. This is what it's all about. This is what it's always been about. Netanyahu said it himself. He's been trying to do this for 40 years, and no other president has been willing to do so until Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has given him the reins, bought and paid for, to do whatever they want. They were going to attack no matter what so they could continue their ambitions for a greater Israel. And the biggest threat to that for them is the Islamic Republic. And so we protected that. We defended that. We are going along and allowing ourselves to be put in harm's way, allowing American soldiers to be put in harm's way. Death, as President Trump said, it happens. That's what happens in war. People die. And there'll probably be more. Because he doesn't care. He doesn't care. Because as we've also spoke, more than likely, for him, this is actually about the Epstein files. And protecting his ass from prison. But as you see this, I know this was way longer than I planned on it being. If you're still around, holy shit, you're amazing. Honestly, you're amazing if you're still around. But as you can see, this has been a long history of of U.S. and Iran, and the give and take, the assistance and then backing out, assistance and backing out, or using them for this and then throwing them under the bus for this. And if it wasn't us, then it was the UK, or it was Russia. Iran has been a playground for Western and Russian imperialism, colonization, now for centuries. Over a century. And it's no wonder with the constant being taken advantage of, being told and promised all these promises, and then Western civilization, all these promises being broken or being manipulated, being taken advantage of, corruption, things being forced on them that they never asked for. And why that would ultimately, after over 100 years, cause a distaste in these people for America, for Western culture, for Europe. I mean, it's a wonder. It's a wonder. But we think, wow, We're so privileged by our society and the way we live, and we think nope, everybody should accept this. Everybody should be happy, and everybody should be okay with this. This is the best way you could possibly live. But that's just not the way. It's not the way. It's not the way some people think. Some people would prefer just being a tradition, or at least, at the very least, be allowed that tradition. And the last time they dealt with westernization, they weren't allowed to do it. It was being forced on them. An authoritarian governance that was forcing westernization on them. That's not the way to westernize any country. It was a failure of westernization. It was a failure of democracy. And the way that we are going about it now, do we think force once again is going to make it all good this time? That they're just going to be like, yay, thank you very much. History doesn't agree with that. Thank you very much. Let me know what you think. Until next time, peace. Clear Talk. I'm out.